Welcome to our new channel, Genre Fans. These reviews will be completely full of spoilers, so consider yourself warned. Look out for our videos every other week. If you notice any glaring omissions or have any opinion or insight to share, please comment below. And take a second to like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and select all so you can know first thing when we post. Don't forget to let your film nerd friends know about our channel. Italians don't think of the term Giallo as genre or subgenre. Academic Michael Coven discusses how Giallo is defined by metonymy and signifies a broader genre label. The term Giallo acts as a metonym for the entire mystery genre. In a British or North American bookstore, if we wanted to find, say, an Agatha Christie novel, we would look for a section called Mystery. However, in an Italian bookstore, that section would likely be called Giallo. So at the most basic level, any murder mystery narrative could be classified as Giallo. Even though Italians have a term for a genre called genere, I just want to note that I will be butchering the pronunciation of these Italian phrases, and I apologize. The term Filone, meaning literally stream or current, is more commonplace in describing unified bodies and subsections of work. The etymology of the word has its roots in scientific contexts, especially geology, where it signifies the main current in a river. Coven writes, Filone tends to be used more idiomatically. Even the geological use of Filone has an English equivalent, to be in the vein of. Paul Hoffman, writing in the New York Times, defined Filone as streamlet, as in a small stream off a main river. Putting these together, if we think of a larger generic pattern as a river, in this context the Giallo is genre, several smaller streamlets branch off from that genre river, occasionally reconnecting to the main flow farther downstream. In some cases, what we think of as a film genre, like the Giallo, may be a cluster of concurrent streamlets, veins, or traditions. Filone. This mode of thinking about genre is helpful and generative when looking at Giallo films because they are isolated to a specific historical period, unlike mysteries, comedies, costume dramas, and other genres that have been around since cinema's silent period and continue to persist today. To quote Michael Mackenzie's 2013 PhD thesis, this notion of imitation to the point of plagiarism is vividly illustrated by an oft-quoted statement by Giallo director Luigi Cozzi. In Italy, when you bring a script to a producer, the first question he asks is not, what is your film like, but what film is your film like? These imitations were released in a relatively short space of time, tending to exhaust their potential and their audience's patience for constantly being subjected to more of the same in the space of a few short years. As such, each of these movements is tied not only to a specific set of generic conventions, but also to a specific period in history. Donato Totaro argues that the concept of Filone is more flexible than that of genre, since it allows for cross-pollination with different cycles. This can be framed within the broader context of the nature of European cinema during this period, the films of which often defy generic categorization. Even in the boom period, we see this cross-pollination happening. For example, in Black Belly of the Tarantula, we have many Giallo staples: the Argento animal title, a mysterious gloved and masked killer, Barbara Boucher's naked murder, posh apartments, and many other Giallo traits. But it straddles the line of the later poliziotteschi, or police procedural thrillers, by following a detective investigating rather than an amateur or citizen detective. In All the Colors of the Dark, we have a mysterious killer linked to a conspiratorial network, the gaslighting of our main heroine, and the false suspect. But this is all played against supernatural occult tropes, which foreshadow supernatural and zombie horror Filone later in the cycle. It's useful to mention the emphasis on the violent content of Gialli and other Filone of this period. To quote Robert Edmonstone's 2008 PhD thesis, a disproportionate emphasis on scenes of often extreme violence and spectacle can be traced across all of the cycles, resulting in a habitual weakening of narrative and disruption of the filmic continuities fundamental to mainstream cinema. This emphasis and the uneasy pleasures that it provides have led to a distinct distinct ghettoization of the Filone within the English language film criticism, with historical accounts of Italian cinema ignoring the films completely, dismissing them as trash, or portraying them as parasitic counterfeits of authentic Hollywood genre films. Giallo shares an almost equal space with spaghetti westerns, commedia all'italiana, sandal or peplum, i.e. ancient or biblical epics, horror and zombie films, mondo movies, and poliziotteschi or spaghetti crime dramas. It also otherizes these films in relation to their mainstream or respectable and authentic counterparts. Like the Grand Guignol or Tin Pan Alley, Giallo were intended to be strictly for the masses. Throughout the 1930s and early 40s, Mussolini and his fascist government absorbed the national film offices and banned most, if not all, American, European, and Soviet films with overt anti-fascist, communist, anti-war, pacifist sentiments. For example, Renoir's 1937 Grand Illusion, French poetic realism, Eisenstein, and American gangster films were all banned because they represented a threat to the quote-unquote Italian character. Mussolini favored homeland propaganda in the form of both newsreels and an Italian cinema intended to rival Hollywood's global dominance. To this end, he modernized Italy's film industry, co-founding Cinecittà Studios in Rome with his son Vittorio in 1937, with Luigi Fredi at its head. Cinecitta's slogan was, "Cinema is the most powerful weapon," recalling the gleeful violence of Italian futurists like Marinetti, who wrote poems celebrating race cars, bombs, and the mechanized death of contemporary war. Unlike the fascist avant-garde, Mussolini embraced standard cinema of quality fare, like peplum epics and bland heroic aviation films. Notably, there was a large output of telefoni bianchi, or white telephone films, which were imitations of Hollywood comedies. They featured Art Deco sets, children with Shirley Temple curls, and glamorous leading ladies talking on white telephones. They were socially conservative, censoring any quote-unquote moral values that ran counter to the so-called Italian character. Important to note here is Luchino Visconti's Ossessione, an adaptation of James M. Cain's The Postman Always Rings Twice. Surprisingly, it was passed by the Italian censors despite Vittorio Mussolini's dislike of the script. After all, it contains adultery and murder, which the fascists considered anti-Italian values. Many consider it to be either the first instance of or the precursor to the neo-realism, which would characterize the post-war landscape. It's also a suspenseful thriller with an outsider thrust into a murder plot, which makes it tempting to characterize as an early great-great-grandfather of Giallo. However, we don't really consider it as such because it lacks the pulpy grindhouse Giallo tone and veers more art house. We also don't think of it as fully a neorealist film, so it's pretty singular in terms of genre. In the aftermath of World War II, Italy, Germany, and most West European countries were left in a state of material and economic devastation. The Marshall Plan, or European Recovery Program, was passed in the U.S. Senate in March 1948. By April 1948, the U.S. started rolling out payments, with the majority of funds allocated to Allied powers and a smaller percentage to Axis countries, namely West Germany and Italy. Western Europe, as a result, became increasingly integrated and cosmopolitan. This growth was particularly pronounced in Italy, often considered more backward than its economically developed northern European neighbors. With industrialization occurring on a massive scale in northern and central Italy, there followed mass migration from rural areas, particularly in the south, to Rome and to the industrial triangle of Milan, Turin, and Genoa, as its people abandoned agricultural land in search of work in the factories. In Italy, this expansion peaked between 1958 and 1963. Historians term it the economic miracle. Society was transformed from backward and rural to modern and cosmopolitan overnight. Suddenly, people could afford appliances, take time off from work and travel, and tourists came flooding into formerly bombed out and ruined cities. There was a parallel rise in the output of Italian film productions during this period of post-war economic advancement. At the root of this output output was the desire and need to build up an Italian cinema to rival Hollywood. After the war ended in 1945, the new government quickly became aware of the commercial threat posed by Hollywood cinema, and in 1945 formed ANICA, the National Association for the Cinema and Similar Industries. In the face of American dominance of the Italian box office, ANICA's role was to encourage domestic film production and set up trade links with overseas markets. Compared to their West European counterparts, Italians had always shown up in strong numbers at cinemas. Producers and exhibitors were anxious to capitalize on the rapidly increasing cinema-going public. Both sectors, accordingly, did a large amount of market research to calibrate their needs. Exhibitors defined cinemas regionally as prima visione, first-run city center, usually chain cinemas, seconda visione, smaller suburban cinemas, and terza visione, small-town and rural cinemas. Fragmenting and scrutinizing the market in this way allowed entrepreneurial film companies to maximize their profits by identifying specific demographics for each type of filone and subsequently targeting them with the deluge of quickly made and typically low-cost cash-ins. Italian westerns and pepla, for example, were traditionally more popular in the terza visione cinemas of Italy's largely rural south. Since Mussolini had banned all foreign films, there were no import quotas in the immediate post-war period. The market was immediately flooded with Hollywood films following the demise of fascism. Producers had a vested interest in making a regionally diverse array of films that would rival Hollywood's influence. What are now considered some of the strongest films made in the immediate aftermath of World War II were the Italian neorealist films of Roberto Rossellini, Vittorio De Sica, Cesare Zavattini, and others. They were films shot on scraps using mostly non-actors in actual bombed-out locations. They were left-leaning meditations on the material reality of the post-war world. Most importantly, they were majorly influential both artistically and critically. For example, Rossellini's 1945 Rome Open City played in a theater in New York for 20 months. The films won prizes, laid the groundwork for the French New Wave, were and still remain influential. We still see their influence today in the films of Abbas Kiarostami and Jafar Panahi, for example. Neorealism came to symbolize the necessity for unadorned realism at times of national emergence or reconstruction, and had the reputation for doing a lot with a little. At the time, however, neorealism meant little to the commercial ambitions of the Italian film industry, as they made little to no money domestically. Audiences weren't in the mood to see their wartime experiences reflected back to them, and considered the films depressing. They understandably wanted escapist entertainment like Hollywood noirs and comedies. Cinecittà emerged as the secret weapon of the Italian film industry. It reopened after a dark period between 1943 and 1948, following the overthrow of Mussolini and the Italian defeat in World War II. The Christian Democrats disagreed with the leftist ideologies and makeshift production values embodied by the neorealist films, and keen to compete economically with the American majors, the new government envisaged a more profitable, studio-driven, and centralized mode of film production. By the end of the decade, Cinecittà was established as the hub of Italian cinema, a position confirmed by MGM's decision to use the studio to film big-budget epics like Quo Vadis and Ben-Hur. The expansive period in the 50s and 60s is commonly referred to as Hollywood on the Tiber. Hollywood films were shot at Cinecittà for low production costs in English language for global release, and were termed runaway productions as they benefited from local subsidies and tax codes. American filmmakers worked alongside local crews for cheap. This period would reach its summit with Joseph Mankiewicz's 1963 Cleopatra, then considered the most expensive production of all time, plagued with delays and Elizabeth Taylor injuries. It was the first time since the war ended where what was considered a boom in domestic production was unfolding. The films made at Cinecittà were profitable and attracted foreign money. Vincent Minnelli even made a follow-up to The Bad and the Beautiful called 2 Weeks in Another Town in 1962. It's a delightful Hollywood meta-narrative starring Sid Charisse, Kirk Douglas, and Edward G. Robinson that depicts the ups and downs of a film shoot in Rome, and much of the action takes place at Cinecittà. The lasting Anglo influence of this period results in the Anglicization of character and actor names. We see this influence in Giallo, where the main characters have land names, like George or Susan. Luciano Ercoli's wife, the Spanish actress Nieves Navarro, would change her name to Susan Scott. An expanded legal framework, import quotas, and new tax codes for the reinvestment of capital into the Italian film industry made Italian cinema blow up in this period. Foreign, primarily Hollywood films, were heavily taxed, and 80 days a year, 22% of screen time, were devoted to the exhibition of Italian films. The profound effect that this had on the domestic film industry is clear from the fact that between 1949 and 1952, American imports fell by 49%, while Italian productions increased by 62%. Consequent increases in the severity of these restrictions ensured that the number of American imports was further reduced, and by 1960, Italy was importing 185 Hollywood films a year, compared with 400 a decade earlier, a decrease of 54%. At the same time, those Hollywood films that were imported into the country had many of their profits blocked from leaving Italy, the result of numerous pacts made between ANICA and the Motion Picture Association of America. Under these agreements, much of the money that American studios made from Italian box offices had to be reinvested in domestic productions, ensuring that, even if Hollywood films were dominating the market, they were still working to expand the indigenous film industry. Hollywood's influence waned in the 60s due to the breakdown of the studio system, the domination of television, aka films' main rival responsible for the proliferation of widescreen films, antitrust legislation, and censorship. Whereas in Italy, the economy was growing stronger, and in the following 30 years, the Italian GDP per head more than quadrupled, with the number of Italian white-collar workers doubling in the process. Employment was also at an all-time high, and industrial centers in the north were quickly expanding as rural southern workers migrated to the cities of Rome, Milan, and Turin. An emergent culture of middle-class consumption, mobility, and disposable wealth was on the rise. Films could now be financed, produced, and exported at low cost to a huge global market, often returning massive profits to their financiers. The government passed further legislation designed to increase the potential of the film industry, a watershed point occurring with the passing of 1965's Leg Corona, or Crown Law, increasing subsidies, tax rebates, loss returns, and credit facilities for domestic filmmakers. By the time these laws were passed, it was clear that Italy had not only regained a grasp on the domestic market, but had also become, albeit briefly, the most productive national cinema in the Western world, releasing 270 films in 1964 compared to 181 from Hollywood, 148 from France, 108 from Spain, 95 from the UK, and 74 from West Germany. From both an international and domestic perspective, it was clear that the Filone had arrived. Several gialli reflect the cosmopolitanism that came with the post-war loosening of borders. Many were set and shot in foreign cities. What Have You Done to Solange and A Lizard in a Woman's Skin were set in London. Short Night for Glass Dolls was set in Soviet Prague. The Sweet Body of Deborah took place in both Geneva and the south of France. Argento shot The Bird with the Crystal Plumage, The Cat o' Nine Tails, Four Flies on Grey Velvet, Deep Red, Sleepless, and Giallo, either wholly or partially in Turin, using its post-war technological advancement as a backdrop and soundstage to his murderous thrillers. Several gialli and films from other Filone were international co-productions with West Germany, Spain, and/or France. Many spaghetti westerns were shot cheaply in Spain. This influences the settings and backdrops of many of the films, and often imbues the characters with an air of casual globetrotting. The films are all dubbed, meaning that they can be cast with actors of any nationality, and that nationality itself is difficult to discern. The Filone cycles reflect these socio-economic changes despite never overtly commenting on current events. The economic miracle, for better or for worse, restructured society. The traditional family structure, gender roles, political thought, and the role of the Catholic Church were all drastically reconfigured with the rise of cosmopolitanism. The economic miracle had a negative side too. An entire generation was born born out of capitalist alienation. We see this manifested in the intense commodification of daily life, the move to urban apartment units, changes in social dynamics. For example, husbands forming a second family by spending long hours at the factory, and wives having fewer children in a shorter span of time. The proliferation of television and advertising, and so on. People, and by extension society, become atomized. As we move into the later part of the 1960s, we see that Italy is no less immune than the other West European countries that benefited from the post-war boom. A strife born of the intense questioning of consumerist life begins to show. The optimism of the post-war years gave way to unrest and agitation, the most potent symbol of which remains the student protests and riots that broke out in Paris in May 1968. The reasons for this unrest were many and varied: opposition to the Vietnam War, unhappiness with the perceived authoritarianism and isolationism of student life, and a suspicion of all organization, all hierarchy, and of the traditional left, and at once powerful and confused equation of social and of sexual repression. Italy's version of the May 1968 protests in France was the Hot Autumn. The Hot Autumn was a series of strikes spanning 1969 to 1970, sparked initially by students, but which gained momentum with the workforce in the industrial triangle. Laborers who had immigrated from the rural south to city centers during the economic miracle had given up their homes to pursue low-paying, strenuous work. White-collar workers and public servants suffered too. Inflation began to balloon. The children of the economic miracle began to protest, demanding societal change in an anti-establishment tenor. Capital flight, high inflation rates, high unemployment, especially in the South, and a high number of strike days became the order of the day. At the same time, Italy underwent profound changes, and at a rate in which social, geopolitical, and political adjustments were severely lagging behind economic developments and general realities of the day. In this process of development, increasing segmentation and fragmentation was unavoidable. An Italian observer very poignantly remarked at the time, "We Italians are in transit from the past to the future of industrial capitalism without having lived through its present." Despite having gained wage increases, there was still an overriding sense of futility in the air, as if small gains had been made at a heavy cost. The collapse of the students' and workers' protest movements did not, however, lead to a more peaceful existence. The demonstrations of 1968 and the Hot Autumn gave way to the Anni di Piombo, the Years of Lead, a period characterized by intense turmoil that saw conflict between the state and the extreme left and right groups spiral out of control in the form of multiple bombings, kidnappings, and political assassinations. These actions would continue throughout the 1970s, with bystanders often caught in the crossfire, while the mood of paranoia and uncertainty was heightened by speculation about police brutality, government cover-ups, and a Secret Service plot to incite mass panic as pretext to installing an authoritarian regime. Gender roles began to shift in this time period. In 1966, Franca Viola was the first woman to refuse to marry her rapist, a then common practice in Italy. It wouldn't be until 1976 that honor marriages would be outlawed, with the Supreme Court ruling that the spouse who compels the other spouse to carnal knowledge by violence or threats commits the crime of carnal violence. Divorce was illegal until 1970. Abortion wasn't legalized until 1978, and even then it was restricted to first trimester. Carlo Lanzi published Rivolte Femminile, or Women's Revolt, in 1970, spurring a decade of strident, often violent protests. If you're watching a Giallo film and it seems sexist, it's because it is. Ingrained within the films is a deep anxiety over the shift in gender roles and the struggle for women's equality. This tumultuous environment, coupled with the tremendous explosion of the Italian film industry, results in a quick turnaround production style and gives the films their morally retrograde, pulpy edge. Since the industrial apparatus and workforce were still small in comparison to Hollywood, oftentimes several crew and actors would work on more than one project at once, Tin Pan Alley style. The same sets were used on several films. Directors would find themselves as cameramen or assistant assistant directors on other projects in different Filone. The inevitable result of the Italian film industry being so condensed was a remarkable level of intertextuality across the cycles, a factor that now makes the task of categorizing them as discrete genres very difficult. A significant number of the Filone are characterized by their generic instability, frequently combining and realigning on the themes and visual reference of other cycles. The most notable of these being the horror film, which had the longest lifespan of the Filone examined, and whose influence can be traced in the Fione's recurring scenes of extreme violence. The tightness of production and the demand to produce more and more made for some interesting genre mashups outside of the moral code of Hollywood, which was still under the Hays Code until 1968. This frenzied production also meant that if something worked, it must be copied again and again until audiences grew tired of it. This helps explain why the production of Giallo blew up in the way it did after the resounding success of The Bird with the Crystal Plumage in 1970. Suddenly, there were Giallo after Giallo with animals in the title. Like any other Filone, Giallo ran its course relatively quickly. The best of the films truly are constrained to the boom period of 1970 to 1975. As the cycle progresses, many of them begin to grow supernatural and horror in tone. Take Fulci's 1977 The Psychic. Jennifer O'Neill plays Virginia, a woman plagued with cryptic psychic visions of a murder who must exonerate her husband. It's basically a supernatural horror film with a Giallo plot. Bava would pivot to proto-slasher Giallo adjacent fare. Dario Argento would briefly tire of Gialli and make a foray into supernatural horror with Suspiria in 1977 before producing George A. Romero's Dawn of the Dead in 1978. Fulci went on to make his most iconic film, Zombie, in 1979, making The Psychic his last proper Giallo. Sergio Martino made 5 Gialli and quickly moved into other genres. Most, if not all, of the Italian filmmakers who worked in this genre would share a similar story, the exception being Dario Argento, who returned to the genre in 1982 with Tenebrae and made mostly Gialli for the remainder of his career. In conclusion, these films just needed to be banged out really fast, without much thought of making huge philosophical statements or forming a thesis on social alienation like in an Antonioni film. They're cheap grindhouse thrillers that get the job done while refracting the socio-historical makeup of their time. And that's the history of Giallo. On the next episode of Genre Fans, we'll be looking more in depth at the Giallo world, including the filmmakers, actors, and the films themselves. We hope you enjoyed this episode. Please like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and select all so you can be the first to know when the next video is out. Thanks, we'll see you soon.